Welcome to Pressure Point. My name is George Searcy, and tonight our program is on observations from Nicaragua. We have in the studio Michael Smith and Janet Gear, two young Canadians who spent 7 weeks in Nicaragua through November and December. Michael and Janet, you look like two fairly reasonable young Canadian young people. You've spent 7 weeks in the middle of Central America, in the middle of an election campaign, in the middle of a revolutionary war. What would incite you to do that? What would lead you to become involved in that kind of an experience, that kind of a situation?
Well, actually, George, it's not exactly a revolutionary war. It's actually a civil war that's happening in Nicaragua. And I guess that's one of the main reasons that I went anyway. The revolution happened in 1979, and what's happening now is called a counter-revolution, and it's being supported by basically the United States, and it's very damaging to the people in the country. So why I went was to see this revolution, to see what a difference it made for the people, and I'd spent 3.5 months in Sri Lanka on an exchange program, and so I'd seen a country very, very poor, where the people weren't really sure why they were poor or what was happening in terms of their government and so on. And I'd read about Nicaragua and talked with people, other people who'd been there. And so I wanted to see what this difference, what this revolution really was, and how the people were living there.
Janet, you haven't been to Sri Lanka, I presume?
No, I haven't.
Would you answer that question any differently than Michael did?
It was for me an opportunity to have a first-hand experience in a developing country, an education that I thought would be very valuable to me, and it was. I saw it also as an opportunity to say through action rather than through words that what was going on there was important and needed our attention, and by going, hoping to draw attention to it.
How would a Canadian young person find out about a situation in Central America that needed our attention?
I found out through my involvement in the peace movement, which through the church, which led me to actually expanding that to the peace and justice movement, particularly through the World Council of Churches. A couple of years ago, I was educated in that way, and yeah.
Many of us were led through that experience that summer to become involved in other parts of the world. Michael, let's back up a bit. You say it's not a revolutionary war, it's a civil war. The revolution happened in
1979.
1979. Right. Briefly, what was that all about?
Nicaragua was being run and controlled by a dictator called Anastasio Somoza, who was one of the most oppressive dictators and ran one of the most oppressive regimes in the history of Central America. And gradually, over a period of about 18 years, up until 1979, the people became more and more rebellious and more against Somoza, as far right into the middle class people and the business class people finally joined together to oppose him, and had the revolution, which was led by the Sandinista Front of National Liberation, which is the governing party now in Nicaragua.
How long did the Civil War last? That part of the Civil War?
About 18 years, and it cost about 50,000 lives.
Were there any dramatic results of that revolution in terms of the lives of the people in Nicaragua? Is that a fair question for you, Janet?
I would say that what has happened to the people there they would have to describe as dramatic, as far as their education and their opportunity to free health services, and just the
Was there no education before?
Very little education, and
no health services.
No. So the way that they're living now is is definitely a dramatic change from what they had before, the liberties.
Some of the highlights of the things that the Sandinista government has done are with the literacy campaign. In 1979, at the time of the overthrow, the illiteracy rate was over 50%, and now it's down to almost 10%. And in terms of health services, as Janet said, they are now free. And for example, polio has been completely wiped out in Nicaragua since 1981, and in the country next door there's a polio epidemic. Malaria, which was the most impressive campaign, it involved 80,000 volunteer workers administering a 3-day treatment on exactly the same day to every person in Nicaragua for 3 days in a row. They cut malaria by 80%. They cut measles from 3,500 cases a year to 54 cases a year. And these are just some of the highlights of the popular health campaigns. They're called popular campaigns because they involve primarily volunteer workers, and they involve the participation of the majority of people in Nicaragua.
You're painting a fairly rosy picture of something that's happened down there. Did they do nothing wrong?
There have been legitimate complaints about the government. They indeed make mistakes, as everybody does, and admits to those. One of the major criticisms that the government is faced with is the treatment of the Mosquito Indians, the Aboriginal people in the country, who had no allegiance to any government, who are strictly tribal in that respect. And at the time of the overthrow, the people hoped to incorporate that population in the new Nicaragua, and were culturally insensitive about the way that they did that. And so there were some complaints about that, and the government has admitted freely the mistakes that they made and are working on fixing that.
Okay, help me understand now. You have this kind of situation, a very popular revolutionary government coming in, and yet you have this civil war going on. Who is opposed to them? Who could possibly oppose such a government?
Well, basically the United States is opposed to the government. Their reasons, the U.S. reasons for this are, one reason is a strategic reason. Nicaragua is the most ideal site in Central America for an ocean-to-ocean route across the continent. There's a river that runs 80% of the way across the country, and then a short piece of land into a lake that would actually be much shorter than the Panama Canal. So it's an ideal overland route for arms shipments to Cuba. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is they say it's a base for Soviet and Cuban military installations, which it is not. There is no documented cases of that. And another reason they say it's exporting revolution to other countries in Central America. And there has been no documented evidence of that as well in terms of arms shipments and military advisors.
But it's pretty hard to say, with two countries as close together as Nicaragua and El Salvador, that there wouldn't be some kind of influence back and forth between the popular fronts in El Salvador and the revolutionary government, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, even if just in terms of sympathy for each other.
There's definitely sympathy, and I think encouragement, because the rest of the countries have very, very oppressive regimes as well. And they see, wow, look at the things, these people have enough food to eat now. They have free medical services. We could have that too. And so that's the encouragement for other revolutionary movements.
Yeah, what Nicaragua is exporting to those countries is hope and example. That's what it's exporting. That's just as dangerous as...
Even more.
Yeah.
You mentioned the church and its influence in your decision at the beginning. In Nicaragua, are the people Christian?
Yes, it is a Christian population, primarily Catholic. The revolution has been called in some ways a Christian revolution, and by that people mean that the people who were involved in the revolution, many of them joined because of their faith.
Does the whole church support the Sandinista government?
No, it doesn't. The institutionalized Catholic Church does not, for the most part, support
the hierarchy of the church.
Of the church.
Do the local priests? Is there a separation in terms? Are you saying that there's a separation in the church in terms of the support of the revolution?
It's the people kept saying to us, no, there's no separation, there's only one church. And I think what they were meaning to say was that the people are the church, and the people are basically in favor of the revolution, working for the revolution because of their Christianity. And the split comes with the hierarchy and the leaders of the church, you know, for the Pope, the Archbishop, the bishops, and so on. And some of the priests are also opposed to the revolution because they see it as the big communist threat again. And so there's a split in that sense, but the people say, no, there's no split in the church, we are the church.
No, the people won't leave the church for the ideals of the revolution. They believe that those are their church, and that's...
Okay, so you didn't go down there on your own, though. You must have gone with some kind of organization or some kind of group. It wasn't just Michael and Janet getting on a boat and going down to Nicaragua. How did that happen?
The first month that we were there, we were part of a program sponsored by the Anglican Youth Ministries. So that's how we originally were down there. And before we left, we were also made a part of the third delegation of the Witness for Justice and Peace team. So we were a part of that program for the second month that we were there.
When you arrived, where did you go, Michael?
Where did I? Well, we were together as a group.
Right.
We spent about 10 days preparation in Mexico, and then we went to Nicaragua. And as a group, we traveled around the country in some of the areas that had been war-torn, that had skirmishes. And
Pre-1979 you're talking about?
No, we're talking about now. The war is happening right into the center of the country. The country is...
You get the impression out here that the war's on the borders, the south and the north.
No, the counter-revolutionaries now operate right in the central areas of the country. They survive on helicopter lifts of food, of supplies and ammunition and so on and so forth. They have an unlimited supply of weapons.
Let's go back. Where did you go? I'm trying to get a picture of where you went to, what you saw, what you experienced with the people when you arrived there.
Well, the first amount of time we were there, we spent interviewing people, government officials, the people. We went to cooperatives, farm cooperatives, and talked to the people there.
Now you say you talked to the people. I hesitate to be dubious, but you know, do you speak Spanish?
When we first arrived in Mexico, we spoke very little. We had studied previously, pero ya hablo un poco, sí. We learned as we went along, and we learned quite a bit. We also spent 2 weeks on our own, and by that time we were fluent enough to be able to talk to people and ask them important questions that we wanted to know.
Janet, did you get into a kind of village situation or a community situation where you got to know people on almost a personal level? It's hard in 7 weeks, but...
No, actually, it wasn't as difficult as I thought it perhaps would be. When we arrived in San Dionisio, that is the village where the witness teams have been. Though I hadn't been there before.
How big is the village?
The village is a population of 3,000 people. I felt like I was a friend returning to a community. We were definitely friends of those people, though we ourselves hadn't been there before. That was the Canadian friends coming back, and it wasn't long at all before we were just welcomed with open arms into everyone's home, and they encouraged us to talk to them, tell us about us, and give them opportunity to tell their story to us.
Where did you stay?
They cleared out one of the classrooms in the school for us and put in 7 bunk beds, and we stayed there and ate with a group of... The woman who fed us is what they would call a restaurant in the community. She cooks for people, and so we stayed with her during the meal times, and also were guests at different people's houses at the time we were there.
Was the food fairly compatible to your system?
Rice and beans and eggs were what we ate for most of the meals, and so we were very fortunate to get that 3 times a day.
Michael, did you get into that kind of a community situation where you stayed with people for a while and got to know them?
Well, I was with the group as well, living in the school, and the other situations we were in were we traveled to the south. Actually, Janet and I traveled on our own to the south and stayed with the actual, it's called the Guatemala Church in Exile, and we stayed with them in the south. And while we were in the village, we also traveled out to a cooperative in the surrounding area and spent a day there. And we traveled to a man who invited us to his private farm, and we stayed out there overnight. And so we participated in those kind of gatherings and so on.
Hey, now, it's fascinating. You traveled south to Nicaragua. You spent some time with the Guatemala Church in Exile. Is that a Roman Catholic congregation? Or?
Yes.
And they're exiles from Guatemala.
Yes.
Their life centered around the church.
Yes, that's right.
And they're a part of a revolution as well.
They are, basically their function there was to try and get news out of Guatemala to the rest of the world, to let the rest of the world know what was happening in Guatemala. They could not operate in Guatemala because they had been exiled by the Guatemalan government. So they basically sent news reports to North America and to Europe about what the situation was for the people in Guatemala.
Okay, and then you came back north again?
That was the time we were guests of those people between the two programs, and so with the witness team we spent the time in the village in San Dionisio, which I described.
So the second program centered in what?
In San Dionisio, setting up a project to build a school there.
And you two were there together at that point? When did the election move into your perspective and become a part of your experience?
That happened just a few days before the witness team met us on November 4th. And we were, as a part of the group we were originally with the Anglican Church, we were granted official observer status for those elections. So we were able to spend that day in the polls, talking to people and observing what was going on. So we spent that whole day very much a part of what was happening in the country.
What was the mood of the country that day, Michael?
Well, it was different in different parts of the country. We were mainly in the Managua, the capital city, for the election day. And the mood, it was a very, very calm day. Slight tension because people are always worried about, if there's going to be an invasion or an attack or not. But actually being in the polling stations and watching people who had never voted before, the last free election was in 1893, so the majority of voters never had voted before. That's right. And so we saw people who were very proud to vote, and people who were confused and not exactly sure and had to be explained exactly what to do. And I think the strongest feeling from the people was, now, we can vote whatever we want, and it makes a difference. It counts.
Yeah, it was a great.
Was there a choice?
Oh yes, there was a choice. Yeah.
7 different political parties participated, from the extreme left to the extreme right.
And generally, in terms of percentages, what was the result? There are choices too in other countries, but you end up with 99%. Was that the kind of election it was?
No, they won with, I believe, a 67%.
67%, the Sandinistas won, yes.
And we did ask people, when they were voting, or before they voted, were you free to vote for whoever you wanted to? And they were so proud to say yes, we were. And there was, I think the overwhelming feeling for me in watching all of that was a sense of pride that the people had, and very, very proud that they had the opportunity to do that. That was self-determination. It was an act of the self.
You painted a picture of a popular government that made a dynamic difference in the first 4 or 5 years of its life. Do you really feel that there is a danger that government will lose its place, that it will be overthrown?
Overwhelmingly so, yes. There is. Nicaragua has been described as a fragile plant, and that could be trampled on and killed, and that's the picture that I saw when I was there.
What's happening with the Contra war is the people are being worn down and worn down. Over 10,000 people have died in the fighting, in attacks and ambushes and so on, since 1982, the beginning of 1982, when the war started again. And the economic embargoes, for example, we were doing some painting and a paintbrush cost $40. If a light bulb burns out, you can't get a new light bulb. The government has to keep pouring their money into the very, very limited army and defense resources that they have, and so they cannot keep concentrating on the literacy campaigns and the popular health campaigns. And so people are becoming disillusioned, And I mean, you can only stand up to so much of this, and the government is having to take, you know, a firmer role to try and keep things under control.
Did you see, Janet, in your time in the village, any kind of signs of that war or experience results of that war?
The time that we were there for about 14 days, and in that time, 2 young people from the village were killed. They were fighting in the north, and the news of those deaths arrived while we were there. And the whole time we were there, the village was preoccupied with these deaths and what it meant to the people there. So it was a very dramatic time for us to be there. And they were the first people to have been killed since the insurrection 5 years ago. And so the war couldn't have been more real to me than.
How old were the young people?
One was 17, the other was 18.
Were you there at the time as well, Michael?
Yes, the one family actually asked me to photograph the funeral for them, for their memories. And it was a very, I guess the strongest feeling for me was frustration, and I felt that was responsible because this aggression was coming from my country. The people never indicated in any way that they were blaming me, but I felt very responsible, and that my country and the country south of me my country wasn't opposing it, first of all, and that the country just slightly south of me was prolonging it, perpetuating this kind of a war against the people.
What is Canada's position in the whole situation?
Officially, our new government has said we follow and support United States foreign policy. But unofficially, we continue development aid projects with Nicaragua. They had contracts with the Liberal government, and they haven't been cancelled. They are still happening, particularly in the dairy industry. But when those contracts run out, I guess that'll be the real test to what the government feels. Joe Clark has mentioned that, yeah, maybe we should have a Canadian embassy in Nicaragua. And he mentioned the other day, I heard on the news, that something about Canadian peacekeeping forces going into Nicaragua. But nothing's ever been done or firmly stated or anything like that, so it's really hard to tell.
So you two now are members of a group called the Witness for Justice and Peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I presume you hope to say something to Canada in terms of what you've experienced. What would you really like people to hear?
I think that what the program does is give people an opportunity to go outside the policies of our government and to say that in being there we are supporting what's happening, and we're drawing the public of Canada, their attention to what's happening in Central America. That's what we can do by being there and by coming back and sharing our experience.
Okay, so you're drawing the public's attention to that, but what can they do about that?
Well, the Monimbo boat, ship, freighter, just left from Nicaragua a few days ago, and it sent on the boat over almost $2 million worth of agricultural supplies, tools, medical supplies, and so on and so forth that were raised by the Coalition for Aid to Nicaragua under the Tools for Peace campaign.
Donations from people all across Canada.
Yeah, and this is one way that people are helping, sending material aid. There is a Farmers Association in Alberta that is sending down machine parts for agricultural machinery. The Woodworkers Union, I believe, is building a technical school, so there's aid like that. But I think, as you brought out earlier, it's important that our government and the Canadian government makes a stand or encourages the U.S. to come to a peaceful solution or something. And if we do live in a democracy, we should be able to pressure that government amongst ourselves. And we hear this all the time with the peace movement and so on. So, you know, we'd like people to find out and write letters. We sent a telegram to Joe Clark during the elections, and we had we appeared with him. We had an interview with him when we came back, part of our group. And so these are important because the government, he said, you know, we want to hear what's happening. And we believe this can have an effect, and we sure hope it can.
Those are very basic things that you've mentioned, Michael, in terms of both the aid that's going and the kind of thing that can happen here. I wonder, you've been back now since the middle of December. Janet, have you heard from anyone since you've returned? Have you had any contacts with people there?
I was very pleased on Monday to receive a letter from a young woman my age who was a good friend of mine in the village where I lived. And she was talking about her reflections of the time that we'd spent together and her hopes for what I could be sharing with people now that I'm back home. And our support is very, very important to them. As little as it seems to us when we're there, our stories are their words, and it's very, very important to them to know that we're back here and we're sharing what we know. And
this is part of the idea of the witness program. We send groups down. There are 2 groups going each month, or one group going right after the other one in February and one in March, and about every 2 months we send a group down continually to keep, a continual Canadian presence there to let the people know.
How is all that supported in terms of financial aid? Does that come from churches and labor unions and all those different kinds of sources? Or do people pay their own way down?
People, for the most part, will pay their own way, but we were very fortunate to receive a lot of aid, financial funding from local congregation, my congregation, the United Church locally, provincially, and nationally.
Okay. Final word. What difference has it really made to you, Michael, that you spent that time in Nicaragua? Briefly.
When I read the newspaper and read magazines, I look at them differently because I know what's behind them. And actually, I've decided to go to university to study international development and to try to understand it better. So that's a real concrete effect it's had in my life.
Janet?
Very much the same. The stories are now realities to me. And I think more than that, the gospel, what I'm trying to understand about the role of Christians in the 20th century, that has a reality for me now that it didn't have before.
And do you see the role of Christians in the 20th century as being built across boundaries and between peoples in a way that sometimes hasn't been there before? You're coming and you're telling the story of the Nicaraguan church, the Guatemalan church, and suddenly it's all here. It's all a part of our life as well as their life. Becomes very real.
Yes.
I think we have to look at it from the perspective that we're not helping them with their problems. They're also our problems, and we contribute to them.
Michael and Janet, thank you very much for being with us tonight and for sharing the observations from Nicaragua. Is there a phone number where someone could call you if they wanted to learn more?
Through the BC Conference Office, it could get
BC
our
Conference
numbers.
Office, 734-0434. How's that?
Great.
Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank
This
you.
has been Pressure Point, and we'll see you again. Good to have you with us.